The theaters of war, war on land. Trench warfare. The war movement was over. In order to hold their positions and keep out of the line of machine gun and artillery fire, soldiers had to dig down into defensive positions. Thus, trenches were dug along the entire length of the front. As it became clear that these hastily dug ditches were to become permanent, they evolved into complex defense systems on both sides, with the area between opposing trenches known as no man's land. Trench warfare was deadlier for attackers than defenders. Attackers suffered twice as many casualties during the assault on the enemy trench line. Machine guns and grenades were useful technology developed during trench warfare. The machine gun could fire 600 rounds per minute. The effects were devastating on attackers. Soldiers also used hand grenades, essentially small hand-throw bombs. Also, heavy artillery was developed and used and was responsible for 70% of all casualties. With the war being so static, the huge guns could take up permanent positions in strategically good locations from where they could launch massive numbers of high explosive shells. Chemical warfare, phosphane gas, which was 18 times stronger than the chlorine gas, and the most feared of all, mustard gas, but a main disadvantage of using gas was a heavy reliance on the wind to push the gas over to the enemy side. The tank was developed and was able to advance ahead of the infantry, crushing barbed wire fences and attacking the enemy at the same time with machine gun and cannon fire inside the tank. The crew was protected from small arms of fire from the outer metal armor, and the tank, although it was strong, was slow and unreliable. None of these technological developments in weaponry or the variations in tactics were ultimately decisive during the fighting on the Western Front. Nevertheless, the developments that did take place during the course of war did allow for a change of tactics by the final campaigns of 1918 and developed a role in the final success of the Allied advance in 1918. War on the sea. From the beginning of the war, it was clear that control of the seas were crucial to both sides. Britain needed to be able to transport men and supplies to the battlefields of Europe and the Middle East. Submarines and also use of sea mines were developed and changed the conduct of naval warfare. Previously, naval actions had been carried out on the surface, often at close range. The development, however, of the torpedo and the submarine made these large battleships vulnerable and almost defenseless. It was the turning point in naval warfare. The Britain Navy enjoyed supremacy for the course of the war and was crucial in moving 8.5 million troops across the British Empire, as well as troops and supplies from Britain across the Channel to France. Imports continued to reach Britain, and the Allies were able to establish and maintain the devastating blockade on Germany. Ultimately, these also were able to sustain in convoy system and transport American men and equipment to Europe for the final battles. War in the air. In early stages of the war, aerial attacks were the most devastating and useful in warfare. The Germans, however, with their more advanced airship called the Zeppelin, soon realized the potential of the airship for carrying out bombings on civilians and industrial targets in Britain. At the start of the war, the Germans had a force of 30 Zeppelins, the Gotha. This bomber caused nearly 3,000 casualties in raids against London and southeast England. The British responded with the development of their own bomber fleet as part as the Royal Flying Corps. By 1918, photographic images could be taken from as high as 4,500 meters. Messages could even be dropped from the aircraft. With the development of the aerial wireless communication was also possible between aircraft and the ground. At the end of World War I was still determined by what happened on the ground, but in both strategy tactics there were signs of what was to come in the next World War. The role of civilians during the war. Impact on fighting on civilians. Paris was shelled from a distance of 126 kilometers by the massive German gun, also known as Long Max. While first the Zeppelins and later planes made raids on Britain British planes also inflicted severe damage on German factories and towns in the vast year of the war. In Serbia, thousands of civilians were slaughtered by Austro-Hungarian troops, while Jews, viewed with a suspicion by the Russian military, were actively attacked by advancing Russians. Impact of economic warfare on civilians. Each side tried to disrupt each other trade routes and prevent vital foods and raw materials getting through by laying minefields at sea or attacking merchant ships with submarines or warships. The British blockade had a devastating effect on Germany, causing desperate food shortages and contributing to Germany's defeat in 1918. The average daily calorie input for a civilian adult dropped from about 1,500 in 1915 to below 1,000 in the winter of 1916. Germany's use of submarine warfare also subjected British civilians to shortages, and Russia suffered as a result of the blockade of the Dardanelles. Women as part of the war effort. It was not until 1915 that serious recruitment for women into industries began. Even then, there was little enthusiasm from employees and trade unions for women entering the workforce. By 1917, 1 in 4 war workers were female, leading French General Joseph to claim that quote, if women in the war factories stopped for 20 minutes, we should lose the war. Women were used as engineers, assemblers, and craftsmen. Acts of genocide. Hundreds of thousands of Armenians died from starvation and thirst when the Ottoman Turks deported them in masses from eastern Anatolia to the Syrian desert and elsewhere. There was disagreement over the number of Armenians killed. Armenians claim 1.5 million, while the Republic of Turkey estimates the total to be 300,000. According to the International Association of Genocide Scholars, the total was more than 1 million. The growth of government, controlling human resources. This decision was taken not just because of the need for more men, but also because British industry could not hold a cord to lose its skilled workers. So many miners had joined up, for example, that a large number had to be sent back in order to maintain the essential supplies of coal. The controlled direction of human resources was necessary to ensure that both industry and the armed forces were provided for. It has been estimated that it took 3 civilian workers to keep a soldier fighting in World War I. The government also took the lead in negotiating with trade unions, also in ways for women to work in the assembly factories, controlling war production, nationalizing key industries such as coal mining and shipping, and also regulating wages and prices to ensure that inflation did not get out of hand. In Britain, involvement in the workplace by the government extended to intervention in areas such as provisions of canteens and childcare, and setting up the various committees such as Health of Munitions Workers Committee. Controlling morale. In order to motivate the home fronts and keep up morale, governments also spent a large deal of time and energy on wartime propaganda. At first, propaganda was used to empathize the defense nature of the war. Later, propaganda became more important to justify the length of the war and to counter opposition to its continuation. Propaganda portrayed the enemy as an inhuman force that must be defeated at all costs, making propaganda a key element of its war policy. Controlling the economy. In order to pay for the British war, Britain increased direct taxation. It also abandoned its 19th century policy of free trade by adopting tariffs on certain types of imported goods. All countries borrowed immense sums to pay for the war. French and Italians borrowed heavily from the British and the Americans. The British also borrowed massive amounts from the USA. In Germany, money for the war was raised almost entirely through loans and government savings bonds, which the government intended to repay when victory came. When defeat came, however, Germany was bankrupt and thousands of Germans lost their savings. So, to answer the final question, in what way was World War One a total war? When talking about World War One and it being a quote unquote total war, it is completely and undoubtedly considered can be considered a total war, let alone it being the first war involving the world and multinational superpowers. The total involvement of the population in almost every country developed and led to advances in strategy and overall technology, including grenades, machine guns, submarines, zeppelins, bombs, military strategies, tariffs, controlling of waters, and taxation to defeat other countries. Warfare involving other countries' economies, morale, and civilians being attacked most definitely involved them in the war. Also, the advancement in women in opportunities for women and involvement in everyday society life. So, in conclusion, with the historical impact and the required participation of entire countries and populations, not not only soldiers but entire countries, World War One was completely a total involvement.